Hi, this is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at Troublemaker Rodeo. I'll do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes, ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll take a look at writing samples that I did on other types of paper. I'll compare Rodeo to similar inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the water resistance test and chromatographies for Troublemaker Rodeo. The writing samples that I did with my glass dip nib were very pleasant. The ink came off the nib nice and uniformly, and it was just a pleasant writing experience. The swatch that I did with tweezers was crisp and surprisingly uniform in shade until I got to the very end, the drip at the very end of the swatch. The drip at the end of the swatch has a little bit of shading going on, like a halo of slightly darker color, just enough to give it a little bit of character, but no sheen. Interestingly, the swatches, the tweezer swatches on other types of paper were very inconsistent, and I'll talk about that when I get to those other papers. The first pen I'm going to write with is a Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. The line that this extra fine nib puts down is nice and legible and very crisp, surprisingly legible for as pale of an ink this is. It's not really scratchy, but there's a little more feedback than I prefer, but it does look really good. This isn't a pen and ink combination that I would reach for, but if I had to write with it, it wouldn't be a bad experience. Next, I'll be writing with my Lamy logo. It has a fine stainless steel nib. In these writing samples I've been doing, I've been surprised by how much I'm enjoying this Lamy fine nib. The line it puts down doesn't look that exceptionally great, but the feeling of the nib on the paper, and I've just really enjoyed it. Now, I have to say I'm kind of surprised that this Tomoe River paper wasn't one of my favorites. I'm going to put a straight face on this one. There are papers I preferred more. Nothing really stands out with this pen and paper combo. I think maybe it feels a little bit drier than it did on some of the other papers. Next, I'll be writing with my Parker Premier. It has an 18 karat medium nib. This is multiple times that this has happened. This nib tends to just have the slightest little hard starts. And so after I do the little scribble, no more skipping or anything, but if I don't do the little scribble, I'll have just a slight little hard start on the first character. Other than that, the writing experience on this paper, I had a little trouble doing the first I there. Other than that, it feels pretty nice. I like the feedback on this nib. I wouldn't hardly call it feedback. It's a buttery smoothness. It's not glassy smooth. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel CM nib. This nib has been hit and miss depending on the paper. Some papers it feels too dry. Some it has felt really nice. On this one, it's just so-so. Not bad, not fun. Next, I'll be writing with the Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. This is an enjoyable nib to write with this type of low saturation ink. That's nice. It puts enough ink on the paper that it's not too light. There's a little bit of shading, but it's not splotchy. Just very pleasant. And finally, I'll be writing with my Pen BBS 308. I've replaced the stock nib with a stainless steel 1.5 stub nib. This is nice. Kind of a buttery smoothness, doesn't feel too dry, and again, I'm seeing a little bit of shading. The writing has some nice character to it. One thing I want to note about this ink is that I did all my initial writing samples on the other papers a couple days ago, and then the pens just set on my desk until I started filming today. And I did a little writing sample before I did this one just to make sure that the ink hadn't dried out. Sometimes if the pens, again, I just dip these in ink. So if the pens sit on my desk, sometimes a nib will be dried out and I have to redip it. But none of these had to be redipped. So that's one thing about this ink. It will likely be able to set in a pen for a while without drying out. Okay, while this writing sample dries, let's take a look at some of the others. All right, on my writing sample that I did on Rodeo, you can see that the tweezer swatch just had trouble grabbing the paper, and part of that is I think it's the wateriness of this ink. When I dipped the tweezers in the ink, I just didn't get enough in the tweezers. Not enough would stay in there. It would just run out. A lot of times when I dip the tweezers in ink, I'll get a good amount in between the two, I guess you would call these tines. You might have a little drip stuck to the side of the pen, and you don't really have any trouble doing the tweezer swatch. It behaves like an automatic pen. But this one, each one of these, I have re-dipped it and just could not get a decent ink swatch on this Rodeo paper. Now, one thing to note between Rodeo paper and Tomoe River, this has been kind of a surprise to me. I just tend to think, my brain wants to think that Rodeo is more absorbent because Tomoe River is so thin and smooth, but Tomoe River has a nice amount of absorbency to it. It will grab the ink from the nib and hold on to it without being too absorbent that it pulls too much out and makes a blob. That's part of the magic of the old Tomoe River paper. I don't have much experience with the new, but that's one of the things I like about the old Tomoe River paper. And you can see with Rodeo, sometimes it has trouble grabbing the ink, or when it does grab the ink, it will pull too much out and it might be a little blobby. Actually, copy paper is the one that will, once it grabs the ink, it will tend to pull too much out at one time. I don't want to dog on Rodeo paper too much. Rodeo is actually probably my favorite paper. It's a good all-around paper. It's a nice balance between how much you have to pay for it and the quality that you get. But you can see that several of the broader nibs, it felt like not enough ink was coming out. And I think that has something to do with the way the ink was behaving up here. It just didn't want to pull out and grab onto the paper. The Parker Premier and the Lamy were nice, though. I liked the way they felt. I just liked the amount of ink that came out on these two. You can see on when I wrote the P for Parker, there was just the tiniest little skip on that vertical line. But other than that, the ink behaved very nicely in those two nibs. My Kakuno just felt too dry and scratchy, though. Once you get finer than a fine nib, you really feel the nib on the paper. And you can kind of see in the ink smears that this ink has a little bit of chroma shading to it. Now, I'm filming this early in the morning, and the light that's coming in my window is a little bit weird, but when we get to the chromatography, you'll see why you have a little bit of chroma shading with this ink. On my copy paper that you can see with the 1.5 stub nib, it had a little trouble grabbing at first. The T doesn't even look like a stub nib, but once it grabbed the paper, it did okay, and it felt nice. I don't see much feathering or didn't experience much spread, but all the other nibs just felt too dry on this copy paper. Now, I usually only show like my Rhodia copy paper and the writing sample with the Tomoe River, but I do lots of other writing samples preparing for these videos, and one of the writing samples I do is an Avery notebook that I got from Staples. I think this was in the Martha Stewart section. This was a notebook in her line of stationery stuff. And this is not really fountain pen friendly paper. You can see a lot of inks will bleed through, but this low saturation Troublemaker Rodeo, you can see every pen was very pleasant. I was kind of blown away because I did this immediately after doing the copy paper, so I was really pleasantly surprised by how enjoyable every nib size was, and it didn't bleed through the paper. So this is well, I can't really say it's a nice ink for poor quality paper. This is a hit and miss ink. This is one of those that if you have access to a wide variety of paper types, you'll probably have one that will work nicely with this ink. Okay, Troublemaker Rodeo is kind of a weird color. I would maybe call it kind of a watery chocolate milk brown kind of ink, but you can see on this swatch, if I can get the lighting just right, you can see a little band where some yellow is separating out. We'll see why that is when we get to the chromatography. But here it is compared to Troublemaker Sepia Hour. As I'm looking at these, it's kind of difficult to describe. This looks more brown. This is more of a fleshy color. Here it is compared to Swan Illusion. Swan Illusion has a little more, maybe a grayish brown compared to this pink kind of brown. Cafe Crema has far more yellow in it and shades a bit darker. Three Oysters Buchanson was a low saturation ink that I really liked the performance of. Kind of similar to Troublemaker Rodeo, but it's a much more orange ink. Now I'm going to put Noodler's Rome Burning out here. Now you see Rome Burning is a really more saturated ink. It spreads and kind of not really feathers, but more like spreads on this really good, this is a Tsubame ink collection card. It's typically very fountain pen friendly. Now it did go through in a few places, but Noodler's Rome Burning didn't really perform very well on this paper. But the reason I'm comparing it is that Rome Burning, when you submerge it in water, yellow lifts off and you're left with purple behind. when I submerged a writing sample that I did on Rodeo, when I submerged it in water for 10 minutes, the yellow component of the ink lifted up and you were left with purple behind. But because it's so low saturation, there's not a lot of purple. Some of the writing samples are legible, but I wouldn't classify this as really having any water resistance. And you can see on the chromatography paper the purple bit that was left behind and the bright yellow that lifts up. So if you're writing with a wet enough pen and get enough ink down, you'll have more of this purple component if you get it wet. And here's an old writing sample that I had of Noodler's Rome Burning that I submerged in water. This is Marlman Nemosiny paper, and you can see the purple, the really crisp purple that was left behind quite a bit. And I don't know if you can see, there's a little halo of yellow that kind of washed away. All right, as I was doing my writing samples with Troublemaker Rodeo, there were some unpleasant pen and ink combos depending on what paper I was using, but overall, I was pleasantly surprised by this low saturation ink, the number of good combinations that I had compared to Troublemaker's Sepia Hour, which had more, I feel like looking back, it had more unpleasant experiences, more unpleasant combinations. And I think the difference is, I've kind of noticed with orange inks are kind of hit and miss, and this has a decent amount of orange in it, and it didn't really have any other component in it to balance out the orange. What I mean by that is there's a orange ink that I really like, or an orange-ish ink, Tasha Hokusai Benasuchi, and it's an orangish brown or a brownish orange, but it has a water-resistant gray component that I think that's the component that makes it pleasant to write with. I tried a sample of Kaweco's Summer Orange. I thought I was going to love it because I thought it was going to have a gray, water-resistant component to it, kind of like the Kaweco Palm Green, but it didn't. And as I was writing with that Kaweco, it's Sunset Orange. Kaweco's Sunset Orange, I believe is the name of it. I was really unimpressed with it. It just didn't feel nice on most of the papers and the pen ink paper combinations that I tried. So oranges are really kind of hit and miss with me. But I think, I think it's maybe the orange dyes that are used maybe don't provide the cushion between the paper that maybe some other dyes do. But this was, for a low saturation ink, this one was kind of fun to do the writing samples. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.